The strange encounter. It was a regular Thursday afternoon when Sarah, a kind-hearted cop's wife, stepped into the local supermarket. The day was warm, the sun shining brightly outside, and the store was buzzing with activity. Sarah had just finished a long shift, and all she wanted to do was pick up a few groceries and head home to her family. But what happened next would make this day anything but ordinary. As Sarah moved through the aisles, her eyes caught a small figure in the corner of her vision. A little black girl, no older than 6 or 7, was standing near the canned goods, staring at her. At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. Children often wandered around stores, looking for their parents or simply exploring. But as Sarah continued her shopping, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The little girl seemed to be following her. Every time Sarah picked up an item from the shelf and moved down an aisle, the girl was there, always just a few steps behind. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was nothing. Kids were curious, after all. But the more she tried to focus on her shopping, the more she noticed the little girl. She wasn't looking at the shelves or other shoppers. She was watching Sarah. At first, Sarah tried to ignore it. She thought, maybe the girl just got distracted. But as Sarah turned down another aisle, she realized the girl was still there. Her presence was unsettling. It was as if she was waiting for something, waiting for Sarah to notice her. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Sarah quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder. The girl mirrored her movements, never making a sound. There was no sign of her parents, no one to ask about her. The silence between them felt thick, almost like a warning. Sarah turned into another aisle, hoping to lose sight of the girl. But to her surprise, the little girl was right there, a few steps away, just watching. Sarah's heart began to race. Why is she following me? She thought. What does she want? The little girl's eyes seemed so intense. They weren't the innocent, playful eyes of a child, but something deeper, almost as if she was searching for something in Sarah. Sarah's thoughts raced. Could the girl be lost? Was she in trouble? Turning to the girl, Sarah asked softly, "Are you lost, sweetheart? Where are your parents?" But the girl didn't respond. She just continued to stare at Sarah, her gaze unblinking. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something was not right. She looked around, but no one seemed to be paying attention. The store was busy, and the other shoppers went about their business, oblivious to what was happening. "Hey, are you okay?" Sarah asked again, now a little more firmly, but the girl stayed silent, her gaze fixed. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was no ordinary child simply wandering the aisles. There was something about this encounter that felt off, something she couldn't quite place. As Sarah moved toward the checkout, she noticed the little girl was still there, trailing behind her. She was close enough now for Sarah to hear the soft sound of her footsteps, but still, the girl said nothing. Her silence was unnerving. Sarah's heart began to pound. With one final glance at the girl, Sarah quickly pushed her cart toward the cashier. Her eyes darted to the exit, eager to leave the store. But before she could reach the door, something unexpected happened. The little girl stopped and watched her from the end of the aisle. Sarah paused, feeling a mixture of confusion and concern. What was going on? Why was this girl following her? Who was she? And why didn't she speak? For the first time, Sarah felt completely out of place, as if she was part of a situation she didn't fully understand. As she exited the store, she noticed the girl still standing there, staring after her, her small figure framed by the automatic doors. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then stepped out into the parking lot, her mind racing. Little did Sarah know, this strange encounter was just the beginning. The girl's story was far more complicated than Sarah could have imagined. As Sarah's day moved on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. The question lingered in her mind. Why had the little girl followed her? The mystery was only just starting to unfold. The unanswered questions. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the little girl. As she drove home from the store, her mind replayed the encounter over and over again. Why had the girl been following her? Was she lost? If so, why didn't she ask for help? And why hadn't she spoken a single word? As Sarah parked her car in the driveway and walked inside, her thoughts continued to race. She tried to push them away, thinking it was just an odd coincidence, but something about it didn't sit right. She told herself that the girl was probably just a curious child, nothing more. But the more Sarah thought about it, the more she felt uneasy. Inside, Sarah greeted her husband, James, who was sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee. "Hey, how was your day?" he asked casually, looking up from his book. Sarah gave him a weak smile and dropped her grocery bags on the kitchen counter. It was fine, but something strange happened at the store. James raised an eyebrow, sensing her unease. "What do you mean?" There was this little girl," Sarah began, her voice hesitant. "She kept following me around the store. It was like she was watching me. And when I tried to talk to her, she didn't answer. She just stared at me." James set his cup down, his face serious now. "That's weird. Did you ask anyone if she was with someone?" "I did," Sarah replied, shaking her head. "But no one knew who she was. I even looked around, hoping to see an adult, but there was nothing. It was like she was just there, all alone." She paused, and when I left, she was still standing by the door, watching me. James frowned, concern creeping into his expression. "Did you think about calling the store to see if they knew who she was?" Sarah hesitated, then sighed. "I don't know. It just feels strange. Why would a little girl act like that? I don't think she was lost, not in the way you'd expect." "Maybe she's just shy," James suggested, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Maybe," Sarah replied, but her mind wasn't settled. Something about the whole thing felt wrong. And yet, there was still no explanation for it. It was as if the little girl had some purpose, some reason for following her. But what could that reason be? As she put away the groceries, Sarah kept glancing out the window, half expecting the girl to appear at the edge of their yard. She knew it didn't make sense, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave her. Why had the girl been so fixated on her? And why hadn't anyone else noticed? That evening, Sarah tried to distract herself by watching TV, but the girl's eyes kept flashing in her mind. She could still see the way the little girl had watched her, silent, unmoving, like she was waiting for something. It made Sarah uncomfortable, almost like she had been part of something she didn't understand. Something bigger than just a chance encounter at the store. As the night wore on, Sarah's thoughts turned darker. What if the girl wasn't just a lost child? What if there was something else going on? Could the girl have been trying to tell her something? Or worse, was she in danger? Suddenly, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped Sarah out of her thoughts. She turned to see James standing at the door, holding his phone in his hand. "Everything okay?" she asked, sensing the change in his expression. "Sarah, you won't believe this," James said, his voice low and serious. "I just got a call from a friend at the precinct. That little girl you saw, she's been reported missing." Sarah's heart sank. She felt a rush of both shock and confusion. How could that be? The girl had seemed so normal. No signs of distress, no indication that she needed help. And yet now it all made sense. The girl wasn't just following her for no reason. She had been trying to get Sarah's attention, trying to reach out, but in a way that didn't make sense at first. "Missing," Sarah repeated, her voice trembling. But she didn't look like she was in trouble. I thought maybe she was just curious." James nodded grimly. "It's not just that. The girl disappeared about a week ago, but no one had any leads. Now they think she's been following people, trying to communicate, but no one understood." The room seemed to grow colder as the weight of the news hit Sarah. This wasn't just a random coincidence. The little girl had been trying to reach out, and somehow Sarah had become a part of something far bigger than she had realized. But why? Why Sarah? What was it about her that made the girl single her out? Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece it together, but the pieces weren't falling into place. The mystery, the search for answers. The next day, Sarah could hardly focus on anything. Her mind kept drifting back to the phone call from James. The girl was missing, and Sarah had unwittingly become a part of it. Why had the girl followed her? What had she been trying to communicate? There were still so many unanswered questions, and the deeper Sarah thought about it, the more unsettling the situation became. As she sipped her morning coffee, Sarah glanced at the news on her phone. There were updates about the missing girl, but the information was scarce. No one knew where she was, or who might have taken her. The police had been searching for days, but there had been no leads. Sarah tried to go about her day, but it was impossible to ignore the gnawing feeling in her stomach. She kept replaying the events in her head, how the girl had followed her, how she had seemed so calm, even though she had been alone. It didn't make sense. Why had she been drawn to Sarah? What was the connection? That afternoon, Sarah decided to do something she should have done earlier. She called the local police station. It wasn't easy to get through, but after a few minutes on hold, a friendly voice finally answered. "Hello, this is Officer Stevens. How can I help you?" "Hi," Sarah said, trying to sound calm, even though she felt anything but. "I'm calling about the missing girl. I think I might have seen her yesterday." Her voice cracked, and she paused to collect herself. "I saw her at the store, and she followed me around. I didn't know at the time that she was missing, but now I think I might know something." There was a brief silence on the other end before Officer Stevens responded. "Could you describe what happened?" Sarah quickly explained the encounter. The way the little girl had silently followed her, the odd feeling she had gotten, and how the girl had seemed strangely calm for someone who might have been lost. She mentioned that she hadn't seen any signs of distress, but now, looking back, everything seemed more suspicious. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Sarah added, "but now I'm really worried. What if she was trying to get my attention?" Officer Stevens seemed to take her seriously. "Thank you for calling, ma'am. Your information could be helpful. Can you tell me exactly where this happened?" Sarah gave the officer the details, the store, the time of day, and the aisle she had been in. After confirming the information, Officer Stevens assured her that they would investigate further. "We're grateful for your help. If you remember anything else, don't hesitate to call us again." As Sarah hung up, she felt a slight sense of relief. She had done something to help, but at the same time, the uncertainty was still there. The girl was still missing. The case was far from solved. Later that evening, Sarah sat down with James to talk about the phone call. He listened intently as she explained everything she had learned. And once again, the concern on his face grew. "That's good that you called," James said, rubbing his chin. "But this still doesn't explain why she followed you, or why she was so quiet. Maybe she didn't even realize she was in danger. It's possible she was trying to communicate, but not in a way we understood." "I know," Sarah replied, staring at the floor. "It's just so strange. I keep thinking about her eyes. She seemed almost knowing, like she was waiting for something. But what?" James shook his head. "I don't know. But the fact that she's been following people now makes me wonder if there's something more going on here." The conversation shifted as they tried to piece together what they knew. Sarah thought back to her time at the store, trying to remember any small detail she might have missed. Maybe there was something, anything, that could provide more clues. It wasn't until later that night, while Sarah was looking through her phone, that she came across something unusual, a post from the local neighborhood Facebook group. Someone had posted about a little girl matching the description Sarah had given. But this was different. It wasn't just about her being missing. There was something else in the post. A comment caught Sarah's eye. It read, "Has anyone else seen this girl following people around? She seems to target specific individuals, but no one knows why." Sarah's pulse quickened. Could it be? Was this the same girl? She scrolled through the comments quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. The more she read, the more her confusion grew. Other people had seen the girl too, following them, watching them. But no one could explain why. It was as if the girl was choosing who to follow, and there was a method to her strange behavior. The post was getting a lot of attention, and soon Sarah noticed a new comment. It was from someone who had seen the girl just the day before, not far from Sarah's neighborhood. The post read, "I saw her near the park, looking like she was waiting for someone. But when I tried to ask her if she needed help, she just stared at me and walked away." Suddenly, the pieces started to fit together. The girl wasn't just following Sarah. She had been following others too. There was a purpose behind her actions, a reason for her strange behavior. But what was it? And why was she targeting certain people? The deeper Sarah dug into this mystery, the more questions she had. Who was this little girl? Why was she following specific people? And what was the connection between them all? Sarah couldn't help but feel like she was getting closer to a truth that no one understood yet. But she also knew that with every step closer she came, the danger was growing. Uncovering the truth. As the days passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The little girl's strange behavior weighed on her mind, and she kept looking for any new clues or connections that might explain why this child was acting in such an unusual way. She continued to search online, hoping for more information, but nothing that stood out seemed to make sense. It was as if the entire town was being drawn into the mystery without understanding why. Then one afternoon, Sarah got another surprising call. It was Officer Stevens again, the same officer she had spoken to about the little girl. "Hi, Mrs. Howard," Officer Stevens said, his voice sounding serious. "I'm calling to follow up on the information you provided about the missing girl. We've been looking into it further, and we've made some disturbing discoveries." Sarah's heart raced. She sat up straight, gripped by a sense of urgency. "What kind of discoveries?" she asked. "There's been another incident," Officer Stevens continued. "A woman reported seeing the girl again, not far from her house. But this time, the little girl wasn't alone. She was with a man we think is connected to her disappearance." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected there was more to the story, but this revelation felt like a punch to the gut. "A man," she echoed, her mind racing. "What do you mean? Who is he?" "We don't know yet," Officer Stevens said, "but we've got a description. The man was tall, with dark hair, and he appeared to be guiding the girl rather than forcing her. It seems like he's been hiding her in plain sight, and no one had noticed until now." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she processed the information. Who was this man, and why was he involved with the little girl? Was he the one behind her strange behavior? The more she thought about it, the more questions flooded her mind. The girl was following people, but why? And why had she followed Sarah in particular? "Have you found anything about where they're hiding?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. "Not yet," Officer Stevens replied. "But we're expanding our search. We're also looking into the possibility that this man may have been keeping the girl under some sort of control. We're getting closer to understanding what's happening, but we need to move cautiously." The call ended soon after, and Sarah was left with more questions than ever. The man's involvement only deepened the mystery, and the pieces were beginning to come together, but they still weren't fitting perfectly. There was something Sarah was missing, and she was determined to find out what it was. As she sat in her living room, staring at the quiet street outside, Sarah's mind raced with the possibilities. What if the girl wasn't just lost? What if she had been placed in the path of these specific people for a reason? She had been following people, and it wasn't random. It had to be a message, or at the very least, a clue. But the question was, what was the message? The more Sarah thought about the interaction she had had with the girl, the more she began to piece together something important. The little girl had been calm, almost too calm for someone who had been alone for so long. It was as if she knew exactly what she was doing. But Sarah wasn't sure whether the girl was a victim or part of something more sinister. That's when it hit her. The connection between the girl and the strange man had to be more than just coincidence. The girl had been following people who might have been able to help her, but who else had she followed? And why? Her train of thought was interrupted when her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from James, her husband. It was a short message, but it caught her attention immediately. "I found something. Meet me at the park." A sudden sense of urgency flooded Sarah. What had James found? She grabbed her coat and rushed out of the house, feeling the weight of the mystery pulling her forward. Every second felt critical. She didn't know what James had uncovered, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to the truth. When Sarah arrived at the park, she saw James standing near the entrance, his face pale and serious. He didn't say anything right away, just motioned for her to come over. "I've been talking to some of the neighbors," he said, looking around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "And I think I know who the man is. I've seen him before." Sarah's eyes widened. "Who is he?" "He's someone from the area," James replied. "His name is Marcus. He's had a troubled past, arrests, run-ins with the law. But he's been quiet for the last few years. No one's seen him around lately." The more James spoke, the more Sarah's mind raced. Could this Marcus be the man behind the strange disappearances? Was he involved with the girl in some way? "We need to find out where he's hiding her," James continued. "And I think we need to go to the police with what we've learned. We're not getting any closer on our own." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders. But she wasn't going to stop until she had answers. There was no going back now. She had to know the truth, no matter what it was. The hidden secrets. As Sarah and James returned home, the weight of the discovery pressed on them. They couldn't afford to waste any time. The man named Marcus, someone from their community who had a troubled past, was the missing link in the puzzle. But why was he involved with the little girl? What was the connection between them? Every question felt like a thread pulling at the fabric of their understanding, and they were desperate to find answers. James had already called Officer Stevens to report what they had learned. They knew they had to act quickly, but the urgency was tempered with caution. The man they were dealing with was no stranger to trouble, and no one knew where he might be hiding or what he was capable of. "We need to figure out where he's hiding her," Sarah said, pacing around the living room. "We can't just sit here and wait for the police to handle it. What if we're too late?" James agreed, his expression grim. "I know. We can't trust that Marcus won't do something terrible, but we can't just go running around the neighborhood looking for him either. We need a plan." That's when Sarah had an idea. The girl had been following certain people, Sarah included, and she suspected there was a reason behind it. What if the little girl was trying to lead them to something? Sarah had already been in contact with neighbors, and they had mentioned seeing the girl near certain areas, but nothing concrete had come from it. "We have to think like the girl," Sarah said thoughtfully. "She's been trying to communicate something. We need to figure out where she's been going and why. Maybe she's been trying to tell us where Marcus is keeping her." James paused, then nodded. "You're right. We can start by retracing her steps, where she's been spotted the most. If she's been following people, there must be a reason. She must be trying to get someone's attention." The couple decided to head out, determined to find the little girl's trail. As they walked through their neighborhood, retracing the girl's footsteps, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to something important. They passed the local park, where Sarah had first noticed the girl, and saw the familiar street where the girl had been spotted multiple times. The more Sarah looked, the more the pieces seemed to fall into place. As they turned a corner, Sarah stopped suddenly. "Wait," she whispered. "That's it." Ames followed her gaze. Just ahead, at the end of a quiet street, was an abandoned house. The windows were boarded up, and the lawn was overgrown with weeds. It was the kind of place that people tended to avoid, secluded, forgotten by most of the world. But something about it felt wrong. "That's where she's been going," Sarah said, her voice filled with conviction. "I know it." James looked at the house, his brow furrowing. "But why there? It's abandoned. It's not even close to anything." "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I have a feeling that's where Marcus has been hiding her." They knew they had to approach carefully. Sarah quickly sent a text to Officer Stevens, letting him know what they had found. They didn't want to confront Marcus on their own, not without backup. It was too risky. But time was running out, and they couldn't afford to wait much longer. As they stood in front of the house, Sarah's heart raced. This was it. They had finally found the place, but there was still no telling what awaited them inside. What had Marcus done to the little girl? What would they find when they opened that door? Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Sarah's phone buzzed with a response from Officer Stevens. He had read the message and was on his way to meet them, bringing reinforcements. Sarah and James didn't speak, but their minds were racing with the same thought. This could be their last chance to rescue the girl before Marcus did something terrible. They waited in silence, watching the abandoned house, when suddenly they heard footsteps approaching. Officer Stevens arrived with 2 other officers, ready to act. They quickly formed a plan, keeping their movements quiet and careful. It wasn't long before they were at the front door, the officers positioning themselves for the next step. "On 3, Officer Stevens whispered. 1, 2. Before he could finish, the door swung open, and a shadowy figure stepped out. It was Marcus. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie that concealed most of his face, but Sarah could see his eyes, cold and calculating. He stopped in his tracks when he saw the officers. For a brief moment, no one moved, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus didn't speak, just stared at the officers, sizing them up. "Where's the girl?" Officer Stevens demanded, his voice firm. Marcus smiled, but it was a cruel smile, one that made Sarah's skin crawl. "She's inside," he said, "but I don't think you're going to find her the way you expect." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. What did he mean? Was the little girl still inside? Or had something else happened? Just then, there was a loud noise from inside the house, something heavy being moved, followed by a small voice crying out. Sarah's heart leaped in her chest. She didn't wait for anyone else. Without thinking, she rushed toward the door, determined to save the little girl once and for all. The shocking truth unveiled. As Sarah rushed toward the door, her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what awaited her inside that dark, abandoned house, but she wasn't going to let fear stop her. The cries of the little girl echoed through the walls, each one a desperate call for help. The door was barely open, and Sarah pushed it further with all her might, the sound of creaking wood reverberating in the quiet street. "Sarah, wait," James shouted behind her, but she couldn't stop now. The urgency in her bones was stronger than any caution. The girl was inside, and Sarah was going to make sure she was okay, no matter what. As she stepped into the dark, musty hallway of the house, her eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light coming from a cracked window. There was a strange stillness in the air, but it didn't last long. From deeper within the house, the girl's sobs grew louder, and Sarah's heart broke for her. Every step felt like an eternity, but she moved forward, faster now, following the sound of the girl's cries. James caught up to her and grabbed her arm gently, but firmly. "Sarah, we need to be careful. He could be armed." "I don't care," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear and determination. "We have to save her." James hesitated but then nodded. "All right, let's do this together." They crept down the hallway, taking slow, deliberate steps to avoid making any noise. The air was thick with dust, and the silence of the house only heightened their anxiety. The sound of footsteps came from the other side of the door at the end of the hallway. The girl was still crying, but now Sarah could hear something else. Muffled voices, one of them deep and menacing. James motioned for Sarah to stay back, and she complied, stepping aside as he carefully approached the door. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he leaned his ear against it, listening. "Marcus is talking," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's got the girl with him." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Marcus. She had never been more certain that this was the man who had been hiding her. They had finally found him, but now came the most dangerous part, rescuing the girl. James signaled for Sarah to be ready, and then he slowly turned the knob, pushing the door open just a crack. They peered inside, and what they saw made their stomachs drop. The little girl was sitting on the floor, her arms bound tightly with a rope. Tears streamed down her face as she stared up at Marcus, who was standing over her, his back turned. He was talking to someone on the phone, his voice low and urgent. Sarah's heart twisted at the sight. The girl was terrified, but Sarah could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't giving up, not even in the face of this terror. Marcus hung up the phone and turned around, his eyes narrowing when he saw Sarah and James standing in the doorway. For a moment, the room was silent, the air charged with tension. "You're too late," Marcus sneered. She was never meant to be saved. Without thinking, Sarah rushed into the room, her voice shaking but filled with conviction. "Let her go, Marcus. It's over. You can't hide anymore." Marcus's grin only grew wider. "You think you can stop me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Before Sarah could respond, Marcus moved toward the girl, grabbing her roughly by the arm. The little girl gasped, her face going pale with fear. "Stay back," Marcus shouted, his hand reaching into his jacket pocket. Sarah's eyes widened in fear. He was reaching for something that could end it all. But before Marcus could pull out whatever he was hiding, a loud crash echoed from the doorway. Officer Stevens and his team burst in, guns drawn, ready to act. "Freeze! Police!" Officer Stevens shouted, his voice commanding and firm. Marcus spun around, his eyes wild with panic. For a moment, he hesitated, then bolted toward the back door, knocking over furniture in his frantic escape. He didn't make it far, though. The officers quickly surrounded him, and in seconds, they had him restrained and on the ground. "Get off me," Marcus yelled, struggling against the officer's grip. "You have no idea what you've done." Officer Stevens pulled Marcus to his feet, ignoring his protests. "You're under arrest for kidnapping and attempted abduction. We've got enough evidence to put you away for a long time." Sarah rushed to the little girl, who was still sitting on the floor, her wide eyes filled with terror and confusion. "It's okay now," Sarah whispered gently as she knelt beside her. "You're safe. We've got you." The girl looked up at Sarah, tears still staining her face, but now there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. You came for me." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart. You don't have to be afraid anymore. You're going home." The officers carefully untied the ropes around the girl's wrists, and she rubbed her sore arms, wincing at the rough feeling. "Thank you," she whispered to Sarah, her voice barely audible. Sarah smiled, wiping away her own tears. "You're welcome. You're very brave." The officers escorted Marcus out of the room, his protests falling on deaf ears. The nightmare was finally over. The little girl was safe, and Marcus, the man who had caused so much pain, was going to face justice. As the door closed behind the officers, Sarah pulled the girl into a gentle hug, relieved that the child was finally free from the horror she had endured. But even as she held the girl, she knew this wasn't just the end of one story. It was the beginning of a new chapter for her, one where she would be loved, cared for, and never again left to suffer in silence. Sarah had done more than rescue a little girl. She had shown her that there was still kindness and compassion in the world, even in the face of darkness. A new beginning. The house was quiet now, the chaos of the confrontation fading into the background as Sarah gently held the little girl in her arms. She could feel the child trembling, but the tension was no longer from fear. It was the overwhelming release of emotions that had been bottled up for so long. The nightmare was finally over, but for this little girl, the journey to healing had only just begun. Sarah looked up at James, who stood a few feet away, watching the scene with a look of deep relief. His protective instincts were evident, but so was his pride in what they had just accomplished. They had saved her. Against all odds, they had rescued the girl, and now she was safe. The girl's soft voice broke the silence. "Where am I going now?" she asked, her small face filled with uncertainty. She had been taken from her home so suddenly, and now that she was free, it was as though she didn't know what to do with herself. Sarah smiled warmly, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "You're going to be okay. You'll be with people who love you and take care of you. You won't ever have to be scared again." The little girl's eyes welled up with tears again, but this time they were tears of relief, not fear. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know where I'm going." Sarah's heart ached at the sight. "I know it's scary," she said gently, "but we'll make sure you're safe. We're going to get you somewhere you can feel happy, where you'll feel like you belong." Officer Stevens stepped forward, his voice filled with compassion. "We've got a family ready to take you in. They're going to make sure you're well taken care of, sweetheart." They'd been waiting for this moment. The girl looked up at Sarah, and for the first time, she smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. Sarah returned it, her own heart swelling with emotion. As the officer spoke with the girl, Sarah turned to James, her mind racing. There were so many questions left unanswered, so many details yet to be revealed. But one thing was clear: this was just the beginning of the girl's new life, and Sarah had been the one to help her make it happen. "We did it," James said softly, a sense of awe in his voice. "She's going to be okay now, Sarah. You saved her." Sarah nodded, still holding the girl close as they walked out of the room. The air outside was fresh, and the sounds of sirens and police activity filled the air, signaling that justice had been served. Marcus had been taken away, and the little girl was finally going to be with people who would protect her. But as Sarah stood there, watching the officers take charge, she couldn't shake the thought that this little girl's story was far from over. It was just beginning. "Thank you," the little girl said, her voice small but sincere as she looked up at Sarah. "Thank you for saving me." Sarah crouched down to the girl's level and smiled, her voice filled with warmth. "You don't have to thank me. You're a brave girl. You're the one who made it through. And now you're going to start a new chapter." The girl's eyes brightened slightly at Sarah's words, and for the first time, she looked hopeful. Sarah stood up, glancing back at James, who had a proud look on his face. "Let's get her to her new family," Sarah said, her voice steady. She wasn't going to let this child face the world alone anymore. She would make sure that the little girl's future was filled with love and safety. As they all made their way out of the house, Sarah realized that this moment would stay with her forever. She had made a difference. She had helped this little girl find a future filled with love, compassion, and a sense of belonging. And that was something worth fighting for. The day's events would soon fade into the background, but the impact on Sarah and the little girl would last forever. And as they drove away, heading toward a new life for the child, Sarah knew that the world was still full of people who cared, people who would fight to protect those who needed it most. In the end, it wasn't just about the rescue. It was about giving someone a second chance, showing them that they mattered, and making sure they knew they weren't alone. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the world was a little bit better, and the future was filled with hope.